thank you for coming over to Holland. My name is Dalen. I'm chair of the Iran Committee here in the Netherlands. Actually, I have four little subjects that I want to touch. First of all, when we talk with security, people that are involved in security, nuclear ambition of Iran, there seems to be a new theory coming up saying Iran will in the end not create the bomb, but just stop just in front of the line, creating it, therefore not being an official nuclear state, but being capable of putting together it in 3 up to 6 months. What's your opinion about this strategy? Secondly, the economic situation in Iran is deteriorating. It's very poor right now, which means that the middle class is falling apart. How important is it to secure the middle class for a revolution to come, for the change to come? And what, from a Western point of view, should we do in order to support the middle class without creating comfort that say, well, let's just keep it the way it is, and supporting the regime, obviously. And thirdly, my last question, what should be the role of the countries around Iran, Saudi Arabia, etc., in tumbling over the regime in Iran itself?
Okay. I hope I remember all that. The preoccupation with this regime's nuclear agenda may be indeed a valid concern for the international community. I don't believe that it is the central concern for the majority of Iranians. What's central to us is mostly lack of human rights in Iran and lack of freedom. As a matter of fact, a democratic Iran, by nature, will resolve the nuclear crisis in itself. I have my personal opinion, an argument why I believe Iran, it is not in my country's advantage to become a nuclear power. My first argument is Iran, by nature of its strategic depth, human as well as natural resources, has a natural edge and advantage vis-à-vis neighbors in the region. By going nuclear, all we do is to allow them to also become nuclear and therefore have an equalizer, and we lose that natural edge and superiority. Why would we want to do that? In the late 60s and early 70s, one of the considerations that led us to embark on a journey to nuclear energy was at the time where my father believed that oil is too precious a commodity to be only used as a fossil fuel. That its derivatives, the petrochemical industry and byproducts and value added is far more attractive, and that we should start considering alternate energies to produce our energy requirements. At the time, there were other technologies that proved to be not as efficient or cost-effective, such as gas turbines, who were not very efficient, highly polluting, and too expensive. Solar energy was in its infancy and was not, again, seriously considered. The only best option next to oil was nuclear. As such, Iran signed the NPT, became 10% shareholder in Eurodif, which was that consortium, which was to supply Iran with the nuclear fuel for the initial 2 reactors that Iran was building, that were supposed to come online back in 81 and 82, the 2 Bushehr nuclear plants, which of course at the time of the revolution came to a standstill, and many years later and several $billion later with Russian Chernobyl technology, we have yet to produce 1 megawatt of nuclear energy, by the way. At the time, our nuclear scientists went to my father arguing, we know Pakistan is building nuclear weapons, should we consider a weapons program? Our concern back then was the Soviet Union. My father said, so what if we have a few missiles? Are we going to stop 3,000 Soviet missiles or more in front of us? That would be pointless. Saddam Hussein was the next potential belligerent. We were able to contain him conventionally, which led to the 1975 Algiers Accord, which was held until the revolution. There was no reason for us to be threatened by Israel. In fact, Iran was the only country in the region with cordial relationship with the state of Israel. Pakistan has its argument with India over Kashmir, nothing that concerned us, and we had no reason to feel threatened by our southern neighbors. However, as an Iranian, I would argue that I would sleep much less better at night, thinking that half of the region, which are not democratic, are potentially having a missile aimed at me. In what way does that make me feel safer? Number 4, I would argue that the cost of a nuclear arsenal is cost prohibitive from a nation like us. Let us not forget all the criticism aimed in the past at my father just to have a conventional military force, let alone now having to have the cost of maintaining a nuclear arsenal when our country needs so many others. Even on the civilian technology, I would argue that it just makes sense anymore. Look at what happened in Japan recently. It's a disaster in the making. You run a country which is on a fault line, which doesn't have many access to water and local populated area. It simply doesn't make sense. For the sake of being a populist or trying to steer national pride, of course, you can always try to play that card. But if you put your thinking cap on and really think seriously, I don't think that Iran can afford to have a whole proliferation happen in that area at this time. And it can start with us. Not only can we stop proliferation, we can reverse it and have far more guarantees of stability. I think a democratic Iran will be committed to peace, can finally help the Palestinians and Israelis to come in a workable, true peace agreement, at which point Iran can certainly, with the rest of the countries in the Middle East, Israel included, form their own regional security and military cooperation, thereby reducing the annual individual budget of all these countries militarily that could otherwise be spent on welfare programs and many things that our society needs, as well as a common market that will be win-win for everybody, even for Western interests. Iranian having more purchase power means that instead of buying potatoes, we can buy computers. What's wrong with that? And I don't think that our country can have any more oil-based economy. We have to create wealth. We have to create value. We cannot have a true sense of social justice in Iran if there's no wealth to begin with to distribute. It has to be a balanced approach. These are serious considerations. I think it's win-win for all. Unless you want to think doomsday scenarios and a market to have Muslims killing each other and maybe sell some arms to them, but I don't think that's really anything that can be tenable for long term. Unless you think in that way, I think there are a lot of good prospects there. So all of this, I think, is important when we're talking about what's on the plate right now. When you're talking about the degree of enrichment and stop at which phase, listen, the regime cannot be trusted. That's the biggest problem. I could even argue after what I just said, that if back then Iran had gone nuclear, even in a military sense, Israel would not have had a problem. Because at least they could trust the previous regime. Nobody trusts this regime, not for a second. Not that we should do it. Now, on the issue of, if you could remind me of your second question, I would be grateful, because I forgot a little bit.
It was about the middle class and the economic situation.
But again, as you can see, our nation has been struggling throughout these years, trying to maintain itself one or the other. I think, first of all, the middle class has been decimated in Iran. I think the only last bastions of resistance is civil society, as much as they can cope under the circumstances. There's been a massive brain drain. There's tremendous amount of problems, addiction, prostitution, all sorts of problems, depression. These are all symptoms of a dysfunctional system. Not to talk about this mafia-style system that controls every aspect of country. Industry is killed. Labor doesn't have jobs. China is flooding Iran with cheap products, killing any incentive to invest or create any semblance of industry. In short, I don't see how the country can recover under any form other than bringing about a completely different set of circumstances. Again, I say, I don't think that under this regime there will be a light of day for any person who, despite this regime, tried. Many young Iranians have tried to bring about technology, industry, form their own companies, only to face at every turn of the way somebody that has to be bribed, somebody has to be paid, somebody who makes a commission, somebody who favors, if you're part of the religious establishment and their court. Basically, it's no use. So there has to be a fundamental change. And ultimately, I think the question was ending with, can you also remind me of your the third part of the question? Sorry, I'm getting off.
No problem at all. About the role that the other Islamic countries, like Saudi Arabia, has to play in toppling over the regime.
Well, you know, it's a little bit, I think some of these countries are stuck between a rock and a hard place, as the expression goes. It's an interesting question and dilemma for countries like Saudi Arabia. On the one hand, they want a regime like Iran to disappear. On the other hand, to be challenged with a democratic demand is partly a big consideration for many of these countries who've been sweating out the Arab Spring, so to speak. Honestly, I don't know how they will react. But one thing is for sure, right now, they are scared of the consequences of what this regime could become soon. In fact, the silent partner, Israel, is doing most of the talking, but they are not far away from the Israeli position in terms of concern about Iran. All you have to do is to go to the UAE or Bahrain right now and see how much havoc the regime is trying to create, you know, pitting Sunnis versus Shias and God knows what. So as such, I think they want a denouement, but they don't want a conflict. They rather have a scenario that would avoid military conflict, because they'll be also on the line of retaliation at some point down the line as it escalates, and it's bound to escalate. Which is why I think that there is more vested interest to figure out a way where real change can happen. And honestly, if you look at it this way, as I said, the status quo cannot continue to exist. By status quo, I mean a continuation of more of the same, as I said earlier. Again, another round of negotiation. If not in Baghdad, tomorrow in Moscow. If not in Moscow, the day after tomorrow in Beijing. Until when are we going to go on with this? That will simply guarantee the regime to become nuclear capable. And, you know, I don't buy this argument that the religious fatwas prohibiting us from developing WMDs. Trust me, if the Prophet had means to use WMDs in his time for a jihad, he probably would have used it. I don't buy that simply. That's my opinion. You may disagree with me, but that's what I believe.